It was August 1962, and the tape was rolling at Stax Records on East McLemore Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. The studio smelled like cigarette smoke and sweat. The Ampex mono recorder hummed in the corner. Steve Cropper had his guitar in his lap. Al Jackson sat behind the drums. Booker T. Jones was already packing up his organ. And a 21-year-old kid from Georgia, a kid who had driven 300 miles just to carry somebody else's amplifiers, was standing in front of the microphone for the first time in his life at a real recording studio. Nobody asked him to be there. Nobody wanted him there. He was the driver, the roadie, the guy who loaded the trunk and kept his mouth shut. But when Otis Redding opened his mouth and started to sing, something happened in that room that nobody could explain. The engineer reached for the tape machine. His hand hovered over the stop button, and for a moment, just a moment, everything in that studio went completely still. This is the story of that moment. The moment the tape almost stopped, and the voice that refused to let it. But before we get to Memphis, before we get to that microphone, we need to go back. Back to a place where the dirt roads had no names and the only music came from the church on Sunday morning. Dawson, Georgia. September 9th, 1941. Otis Ray Redding Jr. was born in a sharecropper's cabin 7 miles south of town, on a plantation where his family had worked the land for generations. His father, Otis Sr., picked cotton during the week and preached on Sundays at the local Baptist church. His mother, Fannie Mae, worked as a domestic servant in white families' homes to keep food on the table. There were 6 children in that cabin. Otis was the 4th, the first son. Have you ever lived in a place where the walls were so thin you could hear the wind whispering through them at night? Where the floorboards creaked like old bones? Where the only heat came from a wood stove that never quite kept the cold away? That was the world Otis Redding was born into. A world where black families in the Deep South worked somebody else's land, lived in somebody else's house, and thanked God on Sunday for the strength to do it all again on Monday. When Otis was 3 years old, the family packed everything they owned and moved to Macon, Georgia. His father had heard about jobs at Robins Air Force Base. Real jobs. Jobs that paid real money. They settled in the Tyndall Heights housing project, a cluster of small brick buildings on a hill that everyone in Macon simply called the Hill. It was a segregated community. Low income, all black families, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and nobody had much of anything. But they had the church. Vinville Baptist Church became the center of young Otis's world. His father preached there, his mother sang in the choir, and little Otis, barely old enough to see over the pew in front of him, would stand up and sing so loud that the old ladies in the back row would cover their ears and laugh. "That boy has got the devil's volume and the Lord's voice," one of them said. "He is going to be something someday." But someday felt very far away, because when Otis was 15 years old, everything changed. His father got sick. Tuberculosis, the disease that had been quietly eating through black communities in the South for decades, the disease that thrived in poverty, in crowded housing, in bodies worn down by years of hard labor. Otis Sr. was hospitalized. He could no longer work. He could no longer preach. He could barely breathe. Otis was the oldest son. There was no conversation about it. No family meeting. He walked into Ballard Hudson High School one morning, sat through half a class, stood up, grabbed his bag, and walked out. He never went back. He dug wells. He pumped gas. He worked construction. He did whatever it took to put food on the table for his mother and his 5 brothers and sisters. He was 15 years old and he was the man of the house. But at night, after the work was done and the house was quiet, Otis would sit on the front steps of their little apartment in Tyndall Heights and sing. Not for anyone, not for money, just for himself, just to feel something other than the weight on his shoulders. He sang Little Richard songs. He sang Sam Cooke songs. He sang hymns from his father's church. And sometimes, when the night was very still, he would make up his own melodies. Songs with no words yet. Just sounds. Just feelings. just a voice reaching out into the dark. There was a talent show at the Douglas Theater in downtown Macon. Every weekend, local kids would get up on stage and sing for a $5 prize. $5. That was groceries for 2 days. Otis entered the contest and won. Then he won again and again. 15 weeks in a row. 15 consecutive victories. Finally, the organizers told him he could not compete anymore. It was not fair to the other kids. Nobody else had a chance when Otis Redding was on that stage. $5 a week. It was not much. But it proved something to Otis that he had never dared to believe before. That his voice might be worth something. That maybe singing was not just a way to survive the night. Maybe it was a way to survive everything. In 1958, Otis joined a local band called Johnny Jenkins and the Pine Toppers. Jenkins was a wild, left-handed guitarist who played his instrument upside down and put on a show that had audiences across Georgia talking. Otis was his singer. But more than that, Otis was his driver. Jenkins did not have a license. So Otis drove the van, loaded the equipment, set up the stage, and then, if Jenkins was in a good mood, got to sing a few songs before packing everything back up again. For 4 years, Dio Otis Redding crisscrossed the American South on what was known as the Chitlin Circuit, a string of venues and clubs that were safe for black performers during the era of racial segregation. Smoky bars in Alabama, dance halls in South Carolina, juke joints in Mississippi. Places where the audience was close enough to touch, where the floorboards shook from dancing, where the music was so loud you could feel it in your chest. Otis was learning. Every night, every show, every cramped stage in every nameless town, he was learning how to move a crowd, how to make people feel, how to take the pain and the joy and the hunger inside him and turn it into something that could reach across a room and grab a stranger by the heart. But he was still the driver, still the roadie, still the guy nobody important had ever heard of. And then came the call. In the summer of 1962, Johnny Jenkins got an opportunity that could change everything. Atlantic Records, one of the biggest labels in the country, wanted him to record at Stax Records in Memphis. Stax was becoming the most important studio in the South. Booker T and the MGs had just hit number 3 on the charts with Green Onions. The place was on fire, and now Jenkins had a chance to record there with the best musicians in the business. There was just one problem. Jenkins did not have a driver's license. Otis volunteered. Of course he did. He loaded Jenkins' amplifiers into the trunk. He drove through the night, through the cotton fields and the small towns and the long stretches of empty highway that connected Georgia to Tennessee. And when they arrived at Stax Records, at that converted movie theater on East McLemore Avenue, Otis carried the equipment inside, set it up in the studio, and then sat down in the corner to wait. He was not there to sing. He was there to carry amplifiers. But something happened during the Jenkins session that nobody expected. It went badly. Very badly. Jenkins could not find his groove. The Stax House Band, Booker T. Jones on organ, Steve Cropper on guitar, Louis Steinberg on bass, Al Jackson Jr. on drums. They could not connect with Jenkins' style. The takes were flat. The energy was wrong. The session dragged on, going nowhere, burning through expensive studio time. Jim Stewart, the co-owner of Stax Records, was frustrated. Musicians were starting to pack up. Booker T had already left for a club gig. The day was a waste. And then Joe Galkin spoke up. That Galkin was the Atlantic Records representative who had arranged the session. He had been sitting in the control room watching the disaster unfold. But Galkin knew something nobody else in that studio knew. He had heard Otis Redding sing before. "Let the kid try," Galkin said to Jim Stewart. "We have got studio time left. What is the worst that can happen?" Stewart was tired. He was ready to go home. But there was time left on the clock and nothing else to lose. "Fine," Stewart said. "Let him sing." Otis Redding stood up from his chair in the corner. He walked to the microphone. His hands were shaking. He had never been in a professional studio before. He had never sung into a real microphone connected to a real tape machine. Steve Cropper moved from guitar to piano because Booker T had already left. Al Jackson stayed on drums. Jenkins himself picked up his guitar, and they waited. Otis sang the first song. "Hey, hey, baby." It was fast, loud, full of energy, basically a Little Richard impression. Jim Stewart listened from the control room and shook his head. It sounded like every other copycat who had walked through the door. "Is that all you have got?" Stewart asked through the talkback mic. Otis hesitated. There was one more song. A ballad. Something he had written himself. Something personal. Something he was not sure was any good. "I have got one more," Otis said quietly. "Then sing it, and make it quick. I want to go home." Otis closed his eyes. He thought about his father lying in that hospital bed, gasping for air. He thought about his mother working 3 jobs to keep the lights on. He thought about every Saturday night on the Chitlin Circuit, singing his heart out for people who would forget his name by Monday morning. He thought about every well he had ever dug, every gallon of gas he had ever pumped, every mile he had ever driven through the dark. And he opened his mouth. "These arms of mine, they are lonely and feeling blue. These arms of mine, they are yearning, yearning from wanting you." The room changed. You could feel it. The air itself seemed to shift. Steve Cropper's fingers found the piano keys and began playing what he would later describe as church chords. Soft, reverent, instinctive. Al Jackson's brushes whispered across the snare drum. The groove was delicate, fragile like it might break if anyone breathed too hard. And above it all, Otis Redding's voice, raw, aching, desperate, not performing, not imitating, just being, just pouring every ounce of loneliness and hunger and hope he had carried for 21 years into a microphone that was finally listening. But here is the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. The engineer, the man sitting behind the mixing console. His hand was on the tape machine, and during the first few bars of that song he nearly stopped the recording. Not because it was bad, because it was different, because it did not sound like anything else on Stax Records, because the voice was rough and raw and it did not have the polished smoothness of Sam Cooke or the theatrical power of Little Richard. It was something else entirely, something the engineer had never heard before. His finger touched the stop button, and then Otis hit the second verse. And the pain and the beauty and the desperation in that voice filled the studio like water filling a room. The engineer's hand fell away from the button. He sat back in his chair, and he let the tape roll. When the song ended, the studio was silent. That particular kind of silence that only happens when something important has just occurred and everyone in the room knows it. Jim Stewart came out of the control room. He looked at Otis for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that would change the history of American music. "We are signing this kid." These Arms of Mine was released on Stax's sister label, Volt Records, in October 1962. It was a slow burn. A disc jockey named John R., who had a powerful nighttime radio show on WLAC in Nashville that could be heard across the eastern United States, he started playing the record week after week until it climbed to number 20 on the rhythm and blues chart. It sold more than 800,000 copies. But more important than the numbers was what the song proved. Otis Redding had something that could not be taught, could not be faked. A voice that could make strangers feel their own pain. A voice that turned a recording studio into a confessional. Otis went back to Stax again and again. He recorded Pain in My Heart. He recorded Mr. Pitiful, a nickname given to him by a Memphis disc jockey who said Otis sounded so heartbroken it was pitiful. And in 1965, he wrote a song that would define the decade. A song called Respect. In the middle of the civil rights movement, a young black man from a housing project writes a song demanding respect. Not asking for it, demanding it. 2 years later, Aretha Franklin would turn it into the anthem of a generation. But it was Otis who wrote it. Otis who felt it first. By 1966, Otis Redding was the biggest soul singer in America. His live shows were legendary. He would grab the microphone stand and bend it toward him like he was pulling the whole world closer. He would drop to his knees. He would scream. He would whisper. He would make every single person believe he was singing directly to them and only to them. But there was a wall that Otis could not break through, the wall of race. In 1960s, America, the music industry was segregated almost as thoroughly as the water fountains. For a soul singer to truly reach mainstream white America, to play the big festivals and the network television shows, that was almost unheard of. And then came Monterey. June 17, 1967. The Monterey International Pop Festival, the first great rock festival in American history. The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Simon and Garfunkel, the biggest names in rock, and right there in the middle of that lineup, the only soul act on the entire bill, was Otis Redding. He was terrified. He had spent his entire career performing for black audiences who knew his music, who sang along with every word. Now he was about to walk onto a stage in front of tens of thousands of white hippies who might not even know his name. And then Otis walked out, silk suit shimmering under the stage lights. He grabbed the microphone. He looked out at a sea of white faces, tie-dyed shirts, peace signs. And he said 4 words the audience would never forget. "This is the love crowd, right?" The crowd screamed back at him. And Otis Redding tore that stage apart. He opened with Shake, and within 30 seconds the entire audience was on its feet. Then came Respect. Then I Have Been Loving You. Too Long, Slowed Down, Intimate, Otis holding the microphone like he was holding a lover's face. His voice broke. Tens of thousands stood perfectly still, watching a man expose his entire soul under the California sky. He finished with Try a Little Tenderness, starting slow, building, building, building. Until the horns were screaming and the drums were thundering and Otis was on his knees, sweat pouring down his face, begging the audience to give in to the feeling. The crowd exploded. In less than 20 minutes, Otis Redding had done something nobody believed possible. He had converted an audience of white rock fans into soul believers. Monterey changed everything. The British music magazine Melody Maker named him the world's top male vocalist, ending Elvis Presley's 10-year reign. But Monterey also changed Otis himself. Standing on that stage, he had felt something he had never felt before. The realization that his music could reach anyone, anywhere, regardless of skin color or background. He wanted to write something new, something that captured this feeling of sitting between two worlds. In August 1967, while performing at the Fillmore in San Francisco, concert promoter Bill Graham offered Otis a houseboat at Waldo Point Harbor in Sausalito, California. Otis spent several days on that boat, watching the water, listening to the seagulls, feeling the gentle rocking of the tide. And he started to write, sitting in the morning sun. I will be sitting when the evening comes. That was all he had at first. Just those lines, just a feeling, a man watching the world go by, not fighting anymore, not performing, just sitting, just being, just existing in a moment of perfect, exhausted peace. He scribbled lines on napkins and hotel stationery for months, but something else was happening. Otis's voice was changing. Years of screaming on stage had damaged his vocal cords. He had surgery to remove nodes from his throat. The doctor told him to stop screaming, to find a new way to sing. But Otis did not see it as a setback. He saw it as an opportunity. He had been listening to Bob Dylan. He had been listening to the Beatles. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was playing on every radio in America that summer, and Otis was fascinated by it. The layered production, the introspective lyrics. He wanted to do something like that with soul music, and something nobody had ever heard before. In late November 1967, Otis called Steve Cropper from the airport. He did not even check into his hotel. He came straight to the studio. I have got a hit, he told Cropper, and he started singing those lines he had been carrying since Sausalito. On December 7, 1967, Otis Redding and Steve Cropper recorded Sittin On The Dock of the Bay at Stax Studios in Memphis. It did not sound like Stax. It did not sound like soul music. There were no soul shouts, no grunts, just a man sitting still, watching the world pass him by. Resigned, peaceful, melancholy. Jim Stewart, the head of Stax, was worried. "This is not rhythm and blues," he said. Bassist Duck Dunn thought the song was too soft, too different. Zelma Redding, Otis's wife, was unsure about the unusual melody, but Otis would not budge. "Yeah, this is my first #1, he said, and at the end of the recording, when the song needed a final touch, Otis did something unexpected. He just whistled. A simple, gentle whistle that drifted over the final chords like a seagull over calm water. It was not planned, it was not scripted, it was just Otis, being Otis, finding the most human, most vulnerable, most beautiful way to end a song. 3 days later, December 10, 1967, Otis Redding boarded a small twin-engine Beechcraft plane with members of his band, the Bar-Kays, heading to a concert in Madison, Wisconsin. The weather was bad, fog and rain over Lake Monona. The plane never made it. Otis Redding was 26 years old. Steve Cropper got the call on a Monday. They had not even found the body yet, and the label was on the phone, telling him to finish the song. Get it done. Get it out. Cropper went back into the studio alone. He added the sound of seagulls and waves crashing, the sounds Otis had described hearing on that houseboat in Sausalito. He mixed the track. He put it on a plane to New York, and then he sat in the empty studio and cried. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was released in January 1968. It became the first posthumous #1 single in the history of the Billboard Hot 100. It sold over 4 million copies worldwide. It won 2 Grammy Awards. Otis never heard the finished version of his greatest song. He never heard the seagulls. He never knew his prediction was right. Over 4,500 people came to Otis Redding's funeral in Macon, Georgia, overflowing the 3,000-seat City Auditorium. In Atlanta, 7,000 more gathered. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted him in 1989. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award came in 1999. A 7-foot bronze statue stands in Macon today, overlooking the city where a boy once sang hymns in a tiny Baptist church and won $5 talent shows 15 weeks in a row. But the real legacy of Otis Redding is not the awards or the statues. It is the tape. That moment in August 1962, when an engineer's hand hovered over the stop button and a voice from Dawson, Georgia, said, "Not yet. I am not done. You have not heard what I came here to say." Because sometimes the most important moment in history is not when the powerful make their decisions. It is when someone who was never supposed to be in the room refuses to leave, when a driver becomes a singer, when a roadie becomes a legend, when a man who carried other people's amplifiers steps up to the microphone and carries an entire generation on his voice instead. Otis Redding did not ask for permission to change music. He drove 300 miles, carried someone else's equipment into a studio, sat in a corner, and when his moment came, he sang like his soul was on fire, and the tape kept rolling. Maybe that is the lesson, not just for musicians, for anyone who has ever been told they are the driver, not the star, the helper, not the hero, the person who carries the bags, not the person who takes the stage. Your moment is coming, and when it arrives, do not let anyone stop the tape. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment where you were not supposed to be the star, but you stepped up anyway? We want to hear your story.